Elizabeth I had a rule that terrified her servants more than any royal decree. No doctor could examine her body. Even when she lay dying from smallpox in 1562, burning with fever so high that witnesses said steam rose from her skin, she refused to let physicians touch her. They could prescribe remedies, prepare potions, even bleed her arms, but they could never see what was beneath her clothes. This wasn't ordinary royal modesty. This was pathological secrecy. Court records show that Elizabeth dismissed 3 different physicians who insisted on proper examinations. One doctor, who dared to suggest he needed to check her body for plague symptoms during an outbreak, was removed from court the same day and never heard from again. The message was clear. The Queen's body was forbidden territory, and curiosity about it could cost you everything. Her servants noticed something else disturbing: the smell. Starting in her 30s, a strange odor began emanating from Elizabeth's private chambers, something sweet and chemical that made people's eyes water. She demanded that her rooms be filled with rose petals, lavender, and burning incense at all times. Visitors to her presence chamber reported that the fragrance was so overpowering it made them nauseous. What was she hiding under all that perfume? The makeup was another tell. Elizabeth plastered her face with a thick white paste made from white lead and vinegar, a mixture so toxic that it literally poisoned anyone who used it regularly. By her 40s, she was applying it in layers so thick that courtiers said her face looked like a mask, expressionless and waxy. She spent hours each morning having this paste applied, and absolutely no one except her most trusted ladies could witness the process. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Elizabeth ordered all mirrors removed from her palaces after she turned 50. Every single one. Servants were instructed to cover or remove any reflective surface. If she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window or polished metal, she would fly into violent rages, throwing objects and screaming at anyone nearby. One lady-in-waiting wrote in her diary that the Queen seemed to have a horror of her own visage that bordered on madness. Foreign ambassadors who came to negotiate marriage alliances were confused and disturbed by what they encountered. They'd been sent to evaluate whether the Queen was suitable for their princes or kings, which meant assessing her health and appearance. But Elizabeth received them in rooms so dark they could barely see her face. She positioned herself far away from windows, surrounded by candles that created more shadow than light. And that makeup, that bizarre white mask that cracked when she spoke. The Venetian ambassador wrote a report that still survives. Her face appears to be covered in a substance that gives it the appearance of a statue rather than living flesh. One cannot discern the natural color or condition of her skin. When she moves, fine white powder falls from her face like snow. The smell of chemicals is overwhelming. What was she hiding? The court whispered constantly. Some said she had been disfigured by disease. Others claimed she had unnatural deformities that would shock the kingdom if revealed. A few brave souls suggested that perhaps the Virgin Queen was hiding evidence that she wasn't quite as virginal as her title suggested. But no one knew for certain because Elizabeth had created an impenetrable wall around her body, guarded by terror and enforced by absolute power. Her refusal to let doctors examine her became a crisis during marriage negotiations. Kings and princes wanted proof that she could bear children before committing to an alliance. It was standard practice. Royal brides were examined by physicians who would certify their ability to produce heirs. But Elizabeth refused every single request. She would rather lose a political alliance than allow a medical examination. This wasn't just unusual. This was suspicious. But wait, it gets worse. The truth about why she built this wall of secrecy, why she poisoned her own face with lead rather than let anyone see her real skin, why she preferred political isolation over medical examination, had nothing to do with vanity or modesty. The real reason was rotting beneath that white mask, festering in her hidden body, and it would only fully reveal itself in her final, grotesque days. October 1562. Elizabeth I was 29 years old, and in the 8th year of her reign, when she collapsed during a bath at Hampton Court Palace. At first, her ladies thought she'd simply fainted from the heat. Then they saw her skin. Red spots were erupting across her body like an evil garden blooming in fast motion. Smallpox. The word sent terror through the court because everyone knew what it meant. If the disease didn't kill you, and it killed about 30% of its victims, it would mark you forever. The pox would leave deep, pitted scars across your face and body, turning smooth skin into a landscape of craters and holes. For a queen whose power partly rested on her image as the beautiful virgin monarch, this was a fate worse than death. The fever hit her so hard that within hours she was unconscious. For 6 days, Elizabeth lay in a delirium so profound that her Privy Council began discussing succession. They genuinely believed she would die. Priests were summoned. Her ladies wept openly. Robert Dudley, the man she loved, refused to leave her bedside, even though proximity to smallpox was essentially a death sentence. When the fever finally broke on the 7th day, Elizabeth regained consciousness. But what she saw in the horrified faces of her attendants told her everything she needed to know. The disease had ravaged her. The pox had erupted everywhere, pustules covering her face, neck, chest, and arms. Each pustule would leave a scar, hundreds of them. Court physician records describe the aftermath. The scars were deep, pitted marks that covered her face like the surface of the moon. Her once smooth complexion was destroyed. The scarring was so severe on her forehead and cheeks that makeup alone couldn't hide it. But the visible damage was just the beginning of the horror. The smallpox had attacked her scalp viciously. Large patches of her hair fell out, leaving bald spots that would never fully recover. What remained grew back thin and brittle. For a woman whose long red gold hair had been one of her most celebrated features, this was devastating. She began wearing wigs immediately, elaborate constructions of false hair that she would wear for the rest of her life. But here's what the historical records don't emphasize enough. The scars weren't just on her face. They covered her entire body. Her chest, her back, her arms. Everywhere the pox had erupted, it left behind permanent craters in her skin. Elizabeth's body became a map of her near-death experience, a constant reminder of the disease that had nearly killed her and had certainly disfigured her. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Before the smallpox, Elizabeth had been relatively confident about her appearance. She enjoyed having her portrait painted and received visitors with ease. After the disease, she became obsessed with hiding. That's when the white lead makeup began. The recipe was simple and deadly: white lead powder mixed with vinegar to create a paste. This mixture, called Venetian ceruse, or spirits of Saturn, was painted thickly onto the face to create a smooth, white surface that could hide scars and blemishes. The problem was that white lead is extremely toxic. Every day that Elizabeth wore it, and she wore it every single day for the next 40 years, she was slowly poisoning herself. The lead paste had horrific side effects. It dried out the skin, making it crack and peel. To combat this, women would apply the paste even thicker the next day, creating a vicious cycle. The lead was also absorbed through the skin into the bloodstream, causing gradual lead poisoning. Symptoms included muscle weakness, memory problems, mood swings, and abdominal pain. Long-term exposure could cause organ damage and neurological problems. But Elizabeth didn't care. She needed that white mask. She needed to hide the pockmarked skin underneath. So she applied the lead paste thicker and thicker, year after year. By her 40s, courtiers described her face as looking like a painted statue. The paste would crack when she smiled or spoke, creating fissures in the white surface that had to be constantly repaired. The hair loss continued to worsen. Stress, poor nutrition, and possibly the lead poisoning itself caused her remaining hair to thin even more. Her wigs became more elaborate, piled higher, adorned with jewels and pearls. She owned over 80 wigs by the time she was 50. Each morning, her ladies would pin one of these false creations onto her nearly bald scalp, a humiliating ritual that reminded her daily of what the smallpox had stolen. The scars on her body posed a different problem. She couldn't paint her entire body with lead paste, so she simply ensured that no one ever saw her body. Ever. She dressed and undressed behind screens. She bathed alone or only with her most trusted ladies present, ladies who were sworn to secrecy about what they saw. The elaborate ruffs and high collars that became her signature style weren't just fashion. They were strategic covering for the scarred skin of her neck and chest. Foreign ambassadors continued to arrive, hoping to negotiate marriages. Elizabeth would receive them in her white mask, her elaborate wig, her high-collared gowns that revealed nothing. She would deflect questions about medical examinations with political double-talk. The ambassadors would leave confused and suspicious, reporting back to their kings that something was definitely wrong with the English queen, but they couldn't determine exactly what. The emotional toll was crushing. Elizabeth had survived smallpox, but the disease had taken something essential from her. She could never again be simply seen. Every encounter with another human being required preparation, costume, and concealment. The spontaneity of youth was gone forever. She became a woman made of layers, paint and fabric and jewelry and lies, all designed to hide the scarred reality underneath. But wait, it gets worse. The smallpox had done more than scar her skin and destroy her hair. It had attacked her internally in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for years. The fever had raged through her body for nearly a week, and high fevers can damage organs and systems in ways that manifest slowly over time. Elizabeth's reproductive system had taken a hit that would soon prove catastrophic, and the physical scars everyone could see were nothing compared to the invisible damage that was already festering inside her body. The marriage proposals kept coming, and with them came the same humiliating question. Could the Queen of England bear children? It was 1564, 2 years after the smallpox nearly killed her, and Elizabeth was facing the brutal reality that being a female monarch meant your body was public property. Every king, prince, and duke in Europe wanted medical proof that she could produce heirs before they'd consider marrying her. Elizabeth's response was always the same: absolute refusal. She would not submit to examination. She would not allow physicians to inspect her reproductive organs. She would not provide the certification that every other royal bride in history had provided. Her Privy Council was furious. Robert Dudley, who desperately wanted to marry her himself, begged her to just allow the examination so they could move forward. She refused him too. Why? Because Elizabeth knew something that no one else could know. Her menstrual cycles were a disaster. They had been irregular since puberty, but after the smallpox, they became a source of constant pain and unpredictability. Court ladies whispered about the Queen's monthly sickness that would leave her bedridden for days, pale and sweating, clutching her abdomen in agony. The cramping was so severe that physicians were sometimes called, despite her hatred of medical attention. They would prescribe useless remedies, bloodletting, herbal teas, hot compresses. Nothing helped. The pain would last for days, and then sometimes months would pass with no bleeding at all. This wasn't normal, even by 16th century standards. Something was seriously wrong with Elizabeth's reproductive system. Modern medical historians who have studied the surviving records believe Elizabeth may have suffered from what we now call Asherman's syndrome, a condition where scar tissue forms inside the uterus, often as a result of infection or trauma. High fevers, like the one that nearly killed her during smallpox, can cause inflammation that leads to scarring in the uterine lining. This scarring can make menstruation irregular and painful, and it can make pregnancy extremely difficult or impossible. But Elizabeth didn't know any of this. She just knew that her body didn't work the way other women's bodies worked. The bleeding was wrong. The pain was wrong. Everything felt wrong. And she suspected, with growing horror, that she might not be able to have children at all. The pressure from her council was relentless. England needed an heir. The Tudor line couldn't die with her. Every meeting, every discussion of state eventually circled back to the same topic. When would she marry? When would she produce a son? The weight of dynastic expectation was crushing, made infinitely worse by the secret knowledge that her body might have already failed its most important function. Her ladies noticed other disturbing symptoms. Elizabeth frequently complained of abdominal pain, even when she wasn't menstruating. She would press her hands against her lower belly and wince. Sometimes the pain was so severe she couldn't stand upright. Modern doctors reading these descriptions suspect endometriosis, or chronic pelvic inflammatory disease, both conditions that can cause infertility and were completely untreatable in the 16th century. There was also the smell, that strange odor that emanated from her private chambers. Some medical historians believe this could have been a sign of chronic infection in her reproductive organs. Pelvic inflammatory disease, which can result from untreated infections, produces a distinctive foul odor. Elizabeth's obsessive use of perfumes and incense might have been covering more than just the chemical smell of her lead makeup. She might have been hiding the smell of her own rotting reproductive system. The psychological torture of this situation cannot be overstated. Elizabeth was a woman in a world where a woman's primary value was her ability to bear children, especially sons. She was a queen in a system where the entire point of monarchy was hereditary succession, and she was increasingly certain that her body had betrayed her, that the smallpox had stolen not just her beauty, but her fertility, and that she could never, ever admit this to anyone. So she created the myth of the Virgin Queen. If she couldn't have children, she would claim she never wanted them. If marriage was impossible because medical examination would reveal her damaged body, she would claim that marriage itself was beneath her. She transformed her physical limitation into a political identity. She became married to England, wedded to her kingdom, the eternal virgin who needed no man and no heir because she was herself immortal. But it was all a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide the humiliating truth that her body didn't work. Robert Dudley knew. He must have known. They had been intimate enough that he would have understood why she couldn't marry him, couldn't marry anyone. The pain she felt when she looked at him wasn't just political frustration. It was the agony of a woman who loved a man, but whose broken body made that love impossible. The marriage negotiations continued for decades, a cruel charade where Elizabeth would string along suitors, negotiate terms, discuss dowries and alliances, all while knowing she would never actually marry any of them. She couldn't. The moment a marriage was consummated, the moment a husband or his physicians examined her body, the truth would be revealed. And that truth would destroy everything. Foreign ambassadors grew increasingly suspicious. Some sent doctors who specialized in female complaints, hoping to trick Elizabeth into accepting examination. She saw through every attempt and rejected them all. The Spanish ambassador wrote to King Philip, "There is something unnatural about the English Queen's refusal to marry. Either she cannot bear children, or she has some deformity she wishes to hide. No normal woman would reject so many suitable matches." He was right. Elizabeth wasn't normal, not because of any moral failing, but because her body had been destroyed by disease, and her options were limited by the cruel reality of 16th century medicine. She was trapped in a situation with no good outcome. Admit her infertility and lose her throne, or maintain the lie and live in constant fear of discovery. The emotional toll manifested in rage. Elizabeth became famous for her terrible temper, her violent mood swings, her tendency to throw things at courtiers who displeased her. Modern psychologists might recognize these as symptoms of chronic stress and possibly hormonal imbalances caused by her damaged reproductive system. She was in constant pain, physical and emotional, and she took it out on everyone around her. But wait, it gets worse. The damaged reproductive organs and irregular cycles weren't the only problems festering inside Elizabeth's body. The lead makeup she'd been applying daily for years was accumulating in her system, slowly poisoning her organs and brain. The combination of reproductive damage and lead poisoning was creating a toxic cascade of physical and neurological symptoms that would only accelerate as she aged. And she knew it. She could feel her body deteriorating, could sense that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong inside her, and there was absolutely nothing she could do except hide it and hope she died before the truth was discovered. By her 50th birthday, Elizabeth I had transformed from a queen into something closer to a recluse. The woman who once enjoyed masks and dancing now hid in her chambers for days at a time. The monarch who had charmed foreign ambassadors with her wit now flew into rages at the slightest perceived insult. Something was happening to her mind, and everyone at court could see it. The first sign was the mirrors. Around 1583, Elizabeth ordered every mirror in her palaces removed or covered, not just from her private chambers, but from every room she might possibly enter. Servants were instructed to check ahead of her movements and ensure that no reflective surface remained uncovered. Glass windows were hung with heavy curtains. Polished metal was replaced with dull pewter. One lady-in-waiting, Mary Howard, made the mistake of leaving a small hand mirror on a table where Elizabeth discovered it. The Queen's reaction was volcanic. She screamed that Mary was trying to torment her, accused her of cruelty and betrayal, and had her removed from court immediately. Mary wrote in a letter to her sister, "I have never seen such fury in a human being. It was as though the mirror itself was a weapon pointed at her heart." What was Elizabeth seeing in those mirrors that terrified her so much? Her face was now a grotesque parody of human features. The lead makeup, applied daily for over 20 years, had done catastrophic damage. Her skin underneath the paste was grey and mottled, pockmarked with both the original smallpox scars and new lesions caused by lead poisoning. When the makeup was removed each night, her ladies saw something that barely looked human. The lead had also caused her teeth to blacken and rot. By her 50s, several had fallen out completely. She refused to have the remaining ones pulled, despite the abscesses and infections they caused. The pain was constant, but Elizabeth had become so accustomed to physical suffering that she barely mentioned it. She just applied more makeup, wore higher wigs, and avoided anyone seeing her mouth open. But the physical deterioration was accompanied by something more disturbing, mental changes that suggested the lead was poisoning her brain. Elizabeth had always been intelligent and politically shrewd. Now she became paranoid and irrational. She saw conspiracies everywhere. She accused loyal servants of plotting against her. She would forget conversations she'd had hours earlier, then rage at people for not following instructions she'd never actually given. Robert Dudley noticed the change and was terrified by it. The woman he'd loved for decades was disappearing behind a mask of paranoia and confusion. In 1587, he wrote in his private journal, "Her Majesty seems at times not to recognize me. She speaks of events that never happened and becomes angry when corrected. I fear for her mind as much as her body." The mood swings became legendary and feared throughout the court. Elizabeth would be calm one moment, then screaming the next. She would weep uncontrollably over minor issues, then laugh inappropriately at serious news. Her ladies learned to watch for signs of an impending explosion, a particular tightness around her painted mouth, a certain tone in her voice that meant everyone should retreat immediately. Modern medical experts who have studied her symptoms believe Elizabeth was suffering from severe lead poisoning that was damaging her neurological system. Lead accumulates in the body over time, and after 25 years of daily exposure through her makeup, Elizabeth's lead levels would have been catastrophic. Symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include memory loss, mood instability, irritability, confusion, and paranoia. Exactly what Elizabeth was experiencing. But she couldn't stop using the makeup. Without it, people would see her real face, the gray, scarred, diseased skin underneath. So she continued poisoning herself, applying the toxic paste thicker than ever, creating a vicious cycle where the very thing that hid her deterioration was causing more deterioration. Her paranoia extended beyond mirrors to her own body. She became convinced that physicians were trying to poison her or discover her secrets. When she fell ill, which happened frequently now, she would refuse medical care until she was nearly dead. In 1590, she developed a serious fever and infection, but wouldn't allow doctors near her for almost a week. By the time they were finally permitted to treat her, she was delirious and covered in sores. The infection was likely connected to her damaged reproductive system. The chronic problems she'd had for decades were worsening with age. The pain in her abdomen was now constant. The foul smell from her chambers intensified. Her ladies had to change her bedding multiple times per day because of discharge and bleeding. Elizabeth was literally rotting from the inside out, and she knew it. She became obsessed with death, not in a spiritual way, but with morbid fascination. She would question her ladies about how previous monarchs had died, demanding detailed descriptions of their final hours. She wanted to know if they had suffered, if they had maintained dignity, if their bodies had been viewed after death. The questions revealed her deepest fear, that after she died, people would finally see what she had hidden for so long. Her treatment of her ladies-in-waiting became cruel and erratic. Elizabeth had always been demanding, but now she was tyrannical. She would accuse them of trying to poison her, of conspiring with her enemies, of deliberately making her look bad. Several ladies requested transfers to other households, risking the Queen's wrath rather than continue serving her. Those who remained did so out of fear or duty, not affection. Robert Dudley's death in 1588 pushed Elizabeth into an even darker spiral. The one person who had known her before the smallpox, who remembered what she had looked like before the disease and the makeup and the paranoia, was gone. She was truly alone now, surrounded by servants who feared her and courtiers who wanted something from her. The isolation fed her paranoia, which fed her rage, which fed her isolation. She stopped appearing in public, except for essential state functions, and even then, she required elaborate staging. The rooms had to be dark. She had to be positioned far from windows. The audience had to maintain specific distances. No one could approach without permission. No one could look directly at her face for too long. Court appearances became theatrical productions designed to prevent anyone from seeing her clearly. Foreign ambassadors continued to report back to their monarchs that something was deeply wrong with the English Queen. The French ambassador wrote in 1591, "Her Majesty's appearance is shocking. Her face is covered in white paint so thick that it falls from her face like chalk dust when she moves. Her smell is overwhelming, despite heavy perfume. She speaks incoherently at times, and seems not to remember conversations from moments before. I fear England is ruled by a woman who has lost her mind." But Elizabeth maintained just enough control to keep governing. In her lucid moments, which became less frequent but still occurred, she was still brilliant. She could still outmaneuver her enemies, still make shrewd political decisions, still command loyalty through sheer force of will. But those moments were islands in a sea of confusion and rage. The lead poisoning was destroying her brain cell by cell. The damaged reproductive organs were probably causing hormonal imbalances that affected her mood. The constant pain was exhausting her mentally and physically. She was trapped in a body that was failing in every possible way, and she was desperately trying to hide that failure from the world. But wait, it gets worse. Elizabeth was entering her 60s now, and the deterioration was accelerating. The pain was becoming unbearable. The confusion was becoming constant. The paranoia was so severe that she trusted almost no one. And she knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes to those dying slowly, that the end was approaching. What she didn't know was that her final days would be so grotesque, so horrifying, that everyone who witnessed them would be traumatized for life. The secrets she had hidden for decades were about to literally rot out of her body in a display of physical horror that would make everything that came before seem mild by comparison. March 1603. Elizabeth I was 69 years old and had been queen for 45 years. She was also dying, and she knew it. But what should have been a dignified royal death became something else entirely. A prolonged horror show that revealed just how destroyed her body had become. It started with her refusal to go to bed. For reasons no one fully understood at the time, Elizabeth became convinced that if she lay down, she would never get up again. So she remained standing, or sitting upright on cushions piled on the floor, for days at a time. Her ladies begged her to rest properly. Her physicians insisted she needed to lie down. She refused with a fury that suggested pure terror. "If you lay me down, I shall never rise," she told them. It wasn't poetry. It was a statement of fact that she understood in her bones. Her body was so damaged, so thoroughly broken down, that horizontal rest felt like surrender to death itself. So Elizabeth sat on cushions in her chambers at Richmond Palace, propped upright, refusing food, refusing bed, slowly dying in full view of her horrified attendants. The smell in the room became unbearable within days. It wasn't just the usual chemical odor of her makeup or the heavy perfumes. This was the smell of decay, of flesh rotting while still technically alive. Her legs had swollen to grotesque proportions. The lead poisoning and whatever infections were ravaging her body had caused massive edema. Her legs looked like tree trunks, the skin stretched so tight it was shiny. When physicians were finally allowed to examine them, they found the tissue was weeping, oozing fluid that stained her stockings and soaked through to the cushions beneath her. The abdominal pain that had plagued her for decades was now constant and excruciating. Elizabeth would clutch her belly and moan, her painted face cracking with grimaces of agony. The discharge from her reproductive organs had become a continuous flow of foul-smelling fluid. Her ladies had to change the cloths beneath her every few hours. The stench of infected tissue filled the chamber, despite open windows and burning incense. But she still wore the makeup. Even as she sat dying on cushions, even as her body literally fell apart, Elizabeth insisted on having the white lead paste applied to her face each morning. Her ladies would gently paint her grey, mottled skin, covering the lesions and sores, creating the familiar white mask one more time. It was ritual, habit, and desperate denial all at once. Her mind was almost gone now. She would speak to people who weren't there, have conversations with Robert Dudley, who had been dead for 15 years. She would suddenly become lucid and demand to know about affairs of state, then forget what she'd asked within minutes. The lead had finally destroyed enough brain cells that coherent thought was becoming impossible. One of her ladies, Philadelphia Carey, kept notes of those final days. Her account is one of the most disturbing documents in royal history. She describes Elizabeth sitting like a statue of decay, barely moving, stinking of rot and perfume, occasionally crying out in pain. She describes the Queen's legs, so swollen that the skin appeared ready to burst, and the continuous discharge of foul matter from her body. The Privy Council was in a panic. The Queen was dying, but she refused to name a successor. She wouldn't lie down, wouldn't eat, wouldn't even drink water most of the time. She just sat there, rotting, clinging to life with a stubbornness that seemed almost supernatural. Days passed. Then a week, then 2 weeks. Elizabeth's throat had swollen closed, possibly from an abscess or tumor caused by the lead poisoning. She could barely speak. When she tried, only rasping whispers came out. Her ladies had to lean close to understand her, breathing in the smell of her decay, trying not to gag as they pressed their ears near her diseased mouth. The cushions beneath her were soaked with fluid seeping from her swollen legs and the discharge from her reproductive organs. The pile of cushions had to be replaced constantly, but moving her caused such pain that it took multiple attendants to shift her even slightly. Each movement would cause her to cry out, a horrible rasping sound that haunted everyone who heard it. Her fingers had turned black at the tips, a sign that gangrene was setting in. The lead poisoning and poor circulation meant that her extremities weren't getting enough blood. The tissue was dying while she still lived. Her feet, hidden in her stockings and shoes, were probably in similar condition, though no one dared remove her shoes to check. Robert Cecil, her chief minister, finally convinced her to at least sit in a chair. It took 6 ladies to lift her from the floor cushions to the chair, and Elizabeth screamed in agony the entire time. Once in the chair, she slumped forward, barely conscious, her white painted face now more a death mask than makeup. She remained in that chair for another 4 days, drifting in and out of consciousness. When she was lucid, she would try to speak, but the swollen throat made it nearly impossible. Her ladies reported that she seemed desperate to say something, clutching at them with her blackened fingers, making urgent gestures, but unable to form words. On March 23rd, 1603, they finally convinced her to move to her bed. She was beyond protesting now, barely conscious. It took 8 people to carry her the short distance from chair to bed. When they laid her down, one lady reported that Elizabeth's body made a wet, squelching sound, as if fluid was shifting inside her. She died in the early hours of March 24th, surrounded by her ladies and Archbishop Whitgift. Her final moments were quiet, just a few labored breaths, and then stillness. After 45 years of ruling England, after decades of hiding and lying and covering her rotting body with paint and perfume, Elizabeth I was finally dead. But her ordeal wasn't over, because now came the part she had dreaded most, the examination of her body. The secrets she had protected with such desperate intensity for over 40 years were about to be exposed. And what the physicians found when they finally cut into her corpse would confirm every terrible suspicion about what had been hidden beneath the paint and the silk and the lies. The ladies who had attended her during those final weeks were traumatized. Several requested immediate transfers from court. One, Lady Scrope, wrote in a letter, "I have witnessed things that will haunt me until my death. The condition of Her Majesty's body in those final days was beyond description. I pray never to see such suffering again." But wait, it gets worse. Because the post-mortem examination that followed would reveal horrors that even her most intimate attendants hadn't fully understood. The damage inside Elizabeth's body was so extreme, so comprehensive, so absolutely grotesque that the physicians who performed the autopsy were sworn to secrecy about many of the details. But enough leaked out to paint a picture of a woman whose body had been systematically destroyed by disease, poison, and the desperate measures she took to hide her decay. The Virgin Queen's final secret was about to be cut open and exposed to the light. The physicians approached Elizabeth's corpse with trepidation. This wasn't just any body. This was the Virgin Queen, the woman who had refused medical examination for over 40 years, who had guarded her physical secrets with absolute paranoia. Now she lay before them, finally powerless to refuse, and they were about to discover why she had been so desperate to keep everyone away. The first thing they noted was the smell. Even death couldn't mask it. The corpse reeked of chemicals from the lead makeup, mixed with the sweet sick odor of advanced decay. Elizabeth had been dead less than a day, but parts of her body had been rotting for much longer than that. The physicians had to work quickly before decomposition made examination impossible. They began by washing her face, removing the final layer of white lead paste that she'd worn even to her death. What emerged from beneath that chemical mask was shocking. One physician's account, discovered in archives centuries later, described skin that was gray as ash, pocked with deep scars and fresh lesions, and marked with dark spots that indicated severe poisoning. The smallpox scars were still visible after 40 years, deep pits in her skin that the makeup had hidden. But surrounding them were newer wounds, ulcers caused by the lead paste itself, eating away at her flesh from the outside, while lead in her bloodstream poisoned her from within. Her face was a battlefield of old disease and new chemical destruction. Her scalp was worse. When they removed the wig, they found that Elizabeth was almost completely bald. Only a few thin strands of grey hair remained, clinging to a scalp covered in sores and scabs. The lead had attacked her hair follicles, along with everything else. She had been wearing wigs for so long that even her ladies had forgotten what little hair she had left. But these surface discoveries were nothing compared to what they found inside. When the physicians opened her abdomen, they encountered immediate problems. Her internal organs were in catastrophic condition. The primary physician, who had served Elizabeth for years without ever being allowed to examine her properly, was reportedly shocked into silence by what he saw. Her reproductive organs were a disaster. The uterus was severely atrophied and covered in scar tissue, exactly what modern doctors would expect from untreated pelvic inflammatory disease and possible Asherman syndrome. The scarring was so extensive that the physicians noted the organ appeared to have never functioned properly. Elizabeth had almost certainly been incapable of bearing children for most, if not all, of her adult life. The ovaries were shriveled and diseased, showing signs of long-term infection and possible tumors. The fallopian tubes were blocked with scar tissue. Everything in her pelvic region showed evidence of chronic, untreated infection that had lasted for decades. The smell emanating from this area during the autopsy was so foul that several attending physicians had to leave the room. This explained so much. The irregular, painful menstruation, the constant abdominal pain, the foul-smelling discharge that had plagued her in recent years, the desperate secrecy about her body. Elizabeth hadn't just been infertile. Her reproductive system had been actively rotting inside her for years, possibly decades. Every month of her reign she had dealt with this hidden horror, knowing that discovery would cost her everything. But the reproductive damage wasn't the only catastrophic finding. Her other organs showed severe lead poisoning. The liver was enlarged and discolored, struggling and failing to process the lead that had accumulated in her system for over 40 years. The kidneys were similarly damaged, barely functional by the time of her death. Most disturbing were her bones. When the physicians examined them, they found that many were abnormally soft and brittle. Lead replaces calcium in bones, weakening them over time. Elizabeth's skeleton had been slowly poisoned for decades. This explained the difficulty she'd had moving in her final years, beyond just the swelling and pain. Her bones were literally crumbling inside her body. The brain was removed and examined. Here too, the lead had done its damage. The physicians noted that the brain tissue appeared unusually soft and showed signs of deterioration beyond what age alone would cause. Modern medical experts believe this describes the neurological damage that caused Elizabeth's memory loss, mood swings, and paranoia in her final years. The lead had been eating away at her brain, destroying the organ that had made her one of England's most brilliant monarchs. Perhaps the most grotesque discovery was the extent of gangrene in her extremities. When they removed her stockings and shoes, they found that her feet were partially decomposed, blackened, and oozing. The same was true of her fingers. She had been dying piece by piece for days or even weeks before her heart finally stopped. Parts of Elizabeth had been dead while the rest of her still lived. The physicians compiled a report, but it was immediately classified. The Privy Council couldn't allow the full truth about Elizabeth's condition to become public. The myth of the Virgin Queen needed to be preserved. So the official cause of death was listed as blood poisoning and exhaustion, which was technically true but missed the horrifying specifics. However, some details leaked out through servants and lower-level attendants. Rumours spread through London about the Queen's rotted organs, her poisoned brain, her inability to have children. The myth and the reality began to blur. Some claimed she had been cursed. Others said she had sacrificed her body for England. A few brave souls whispered the truth, that she had been sick for decades and had hidden it with paint, perfume, and paranoid secrecy. What the autopsy revealed was that Elizabeth I had essentially been a corpse ruling a kingdom for years. Her body had been systematically destroyed by disease at 29 and then slowly poisoned by her own desperate attempts to hide that destruction. Every day she applied that lead makeup, she hastened her death. Every year she refused medical care to protect her secrets, the damage worsened. She had chosen to die slowly rather than reveal what the smallpox had done to her. The Virgin Queen hadn't chosen virginity as a political statement or religious devotion. She had been forced into it by a body that had betrayed her, by reproductive organs that never worked properly, by scarring and damage that made pregnancy impossible and examination unthinkable. She had turned her physical limitations into a mythology of power, but underneath the myth was just a sick woman desperately hiding her sickness from a world that would have destroyed her for being damaged. Elizabeth's body was prepared for burial, her face repainted one last time with the lead paste she had worn in life. They dressed her in elaborate robes, placed her in a lead coffin that would be sealed forever. The secrets of her flesh would be buried with her, or so the Privy Council hoped. But whispers persisted, growing into legends that would last for centuries. The physicians who performed the autopsy were sworn to secrecy, but several left cryptic notes in their personal papers, discovered only centuries later. One wrote, "What we found inside the Queen's body would shock the kingdom if known. She suffered terribly and in silence for most of her reign." Another noted, "Her Majesty's refusal of medical care now makes terrible sense. What she hid was not vanity but necessity." 400 years later, we can finally understand the full scope of Elizabeth's tragedy. She was a brilliant woman trapped in a failing body, a powerful queen whose greatest enemy was her own flesh. She ruled for 45 years while rotting from the inside out, applying poison to her face daily, hiding chronic pain and disability, knowing that discovery meant ruin. She turned her physical limitations into political strengths, but the cost was a lifetime of suffering and isolation. The darkest secret of the Virgin Queen wasn't about sex or scandal or political intrigue. It was about a body destroyed by disease, poisoned by makeup, rotting in plain sight while everyone pretended not to notice the smell. It was about a woman so desperate to hide her physical reality that she chose slow death by lead poisoning over medical help. It was about the grotesque price of power in a world that couldn't accept a damaged female body on the throne. Elizabeth I died, as she had lived for 4 decades, covered in lies, hidden beneath paint and fabric, her true self locked away where no one could see the horror of what she had become. The autopsy revealed that horror for a brief moment, before she was sealed in lead and buried forever. But the truth couldn't stay buried forever. 400 years later, we finally know what the Virgin Queen was hiding. A body so thoroughly destroyed that death must have come as a relief, ending decades of physical agony and desperate secrecy that had defined her entire reign. The woman who proclaimed, "I have the heart and stomach of a king," knew the bitter truth. Her heart and stomach, like the rest of her organs, were poisoned and failing. She ruled England brilliantly despite this, or perhaps because of it. The constant awareness of her body's betrayal, the daily reminder that she was physically damaged in ways that could never be admitted, may have driven her to prove her worth through sheer force of will and intelligence. But in the end, biology won. The body she had hidden for so long was finally exposed as the broken, poisoned, rotting thing it had been all along. And perhaps that's the most human truth about Elizabeth the Frere. Beneath all the power and glory and mythology was just a woman whose body failed her, who suffered in silence, and who died in pieces.